The velvet blue dress hung in my closet like a battle armor waiting for war. At 72, I had learned that sometimes the most devastating weapons come wrapped in silk and pearls. Today would be the day I reclaimed what had been stolen from me piece by piece over the past 6 years. The invitation to my daughter-in-law Rebecca's baby shower sat on my kitchen table, edges worn from my fingers tracing the elegant script. Baby shower for Rebecca Chin Morrison. Sunday 2 p.m. Registry at Nordstrom. Such beautiful lies, printed in rose gold ink. I had funded this entire celebration. The country club venue, the floral arrangements, the 3-tier cake decorated with sugar butterflies. $8,000 charged to the credit card I had given my son Marcus for family emergencies. $8,000 for a party celebrating my future grandchild, a grandchild I would never be allowed to hold. Rebecca had made that clear from the beginning. I was not family. I was an obligation to be managed, a problem to be solved, a relic from Marcus's past that needed to be politely but firmly erased. She had accomplished this with the precision of a surgeon, cutting away my connection to my only son one small wound at a time. The mirror in my hallway reflected a woman who had survived 72 years of triumph and tragedy. I had buried a husband, raised a child alone, built a successful catering business from nothing but determination and borrowed money. My hands bore the scars of decades spent kneading dough and managing hot ovens. My face showed the lines of sleepless nights when Marcus had pneumonia at 8, when the business nearly failed during the recession, when loneliness threatened to swallow me whole after Robert died. But my eyes, those hadn't changed. They still held the fire that had carried me through everything life had thrown at me. Today, that fire would serve its greatest purpose. The leather briefcase beside my purse contained more than baby gifts. Inside lay 9 months of meticulous investigation, 9 months of uncovering truths that Rebecca Chan had buried deeper than coffins. The private investigator I had hired wasn't cheap, but some things were worth every penny. Rebecca's real name was Rachel Chun Bradley. She had changed it after fleeing Denver in disgrace 3 years before meeting Marcus. The details of her escape were documented in police reports, medical records, and court filings that painted a picture of a woman capable of devastating cruelty when it served her purposes. I slipped into the blue dress and fastened my grandmother's pearls around my neck. Each pearl was a reminder of the women who had come before me, women who had fought their own battles with grace and steel. Today, I would honor their memory by fighting mine. The drive to Willowbrook Country Club took 45 minutes through rolling hills dotted with horse farms and estates that spoke of old money and older secrets. I had chosen this venue myself, back when I still believed Rebecca might someday see me as an ally rather than an adversary. The irony was not lost on me that I would use her own celebration as the stage for her downfall. Classical music filled the Mercedes Mozart's Requiem, providing an appropriately somber soundtrack for what was to come. I had listened to this same piece at Robert's funeral 15 years ago, when I thought the worst pain of my life was behind me. Had been wrong then. The worst pain was watching your only child choose a stranger over the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Marcus had been 28 when Rebecca entered his life like a hurricane in designer clothing. Beautiful, sophisticated, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had never known real hardship. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, she said, traveling frequently for conferences and client meetings. Her apartment was minimally furnished, she explained, because she preferred experiences over possessions. I had admired that philosophy initially. After years of accumulating the trappings of middle-class success, there was something appealing about Rebecca's apparent simplicity. She listened to my stories about Marcus's childhood with what seemed like genuine interest. She asked thoughtful questions about my catering business and even suggested I write a cookbook featuring my mother's Italian recipes. The first warning sign came 6 months into their relationship. Marcus had always called me every Sunday morning, a tradition that had survived his teenage years, college, and early career. Suddenly, those calls became irregular, then infrequent, then non-existent. When I asked him about it, he claimed to be busy with work and wedding planning. Wedding planning that apparently did not require the mother of the groom. Rebecca handled the arrangements with military efficiency, presenting me with fait accompli rather than seeking my input. The venue was already booked. The caterer was already chosen, someone from her network rather than the woman who had fed Marcus for 28 years. The guest list was already finalized, a small intimate affair that somehow had no room for my book club friends or the neighbors who had helped raise Marcus when I was working double shifts. I had swallowed these slights, telling myself that modern brides had different expectations. But the pattern continued after the wedding. Holiday traditions that had sustained our family for decades were suddenly too old-fashioned. The house where Marcus had grown up became too far to visit regularly. My cooking, which had once been his favorite comfort food, was now too heavy for Rebecca's digestive system. By the time their first child, Isabella, was born, I had been relegated to the role of occasional visitor in my own son's life. I learned about Isabella's birth from a mass text message sent 12 hours after the delivery. I met my granddaughter for the first time when she was 3 weeks old, during a carefully orchestrated visit that lasted exactly 90 minutes. Rebecca documented every moment of Isabella's life on social media, sharing milestones and precious moments with hundreds of followers while keeping the child's own grandmother at arm's length. I saw Isabella's first steps on Instagram. I learned about her first words through a Facebook post. When I suggested keeping Isabella overnight so the new parents could have a date night, Rebecca laughed as if I had proposed something absurd. The systematic isolation might have continued indefinitely if not for a chance encounter at the grocery store 6 months ago. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived across the street from us when Marcus was young, approached me in the produce section with a troubled expression. She had recognized Rebecca from one of my photos, she said. But she knew her by a different name and a different story. Rachel Bradley had worked at Sunset Gardens nursing facility in Denver before disappearing suddenly after what Mrs. Patterson's sister-in-law described as a terrible scandal involving missing medication and patient neglect. That conversation planted a seed that grew into the investigation now documented in my briefcase. Rachel Chen Bradley had indeed worked at Sunset Gardens, where she had been responsible for the care of elderly residents in the memory care unit. Her patients were among the most vulnerable in the facility, people with dementia and Alzheimer's who could not advocate for themselves or remember when their care was inadequate. Eleanor Hoffman had been one of those patients. 87 years old, suffering from moderate dementia, Eleanor had been admitted to Sunset Gardens after a fall that left her with limited mobility. She came with a substantial trust fund and a detailed care plan that included regular physical therapy and carefully monitored pain medication. Under Rachel's care, Eleanor's condition deteriorated rapidly. Physical therapy sessions were repeatedly cancelled or shortened. Pain medication that should have been administered every 6 hours was given sporadically, if at all. Eleanor lost 20 pounds in 2 months, developing pressure sores that became infected due to inadequate hygiene. The family noticed these changes during visits, but Rachel was skilled at providing explanations. Eleanor was having difficulty adjusting to the facility, she explained. Dementia patients often experienced rapid decline. The infections were unfortunately common in elderly patients with compromised immune systems. Eleanor Hoffman died on a Tuesday morning in March, alone in her room while Rachel was supposed to be monitoring her condition. The official cause of death was sepsis caused by infected pressure sores, but the family suspected neglect. They hired an attorney and demanded an investigation. What the investigation revealed was a pattern of systematic abuse that extended far beyond Eleanor. Rachel had been stealing medication from multiple patients, selling prescription painkillers to dealers who paid premium prices for high-quality pharmaceuticals. She had falsified medical records to cover her tracks, documenting care that was never provided and medications that were never administered. The missing medication meant that patients like Eleanor suffered in pain that could have been managed. The neglected care meant that treatable conditions became life-threatening. Rachel had prioritized her illegal drug operation over the well-being of the people entrusted to her care. When the investigation closed in on her, Rachel disappeared. She cleaned out her apartment over a weekend, leaving no forwarding address and no explanation for her colleagues. The nursing home settled with Eleanor's family for an undisclosed amount, while Rachel vanished into the anonymity of a different city and a carefully constructed new identity. That new identity was Rebecca Chin Morrison, pharmaceutical sales representative, woman of mystery and minimal possessions. She had chosen her cover story carefully, selecting a profession that explained her frequent travel and reluctance to form deep connections. She had studied Marcus before approaching him, I realized now, identifying him as the perfect Mark. Successful, lonely, eager for companionship, and blessed with a trusting nature that would not question inconsistencies in her story. The country club parking lot was full when I arrived, luxury vehicles gleaming in the afternoon sunshine. Through the windows, I could see women in pastel dresses clustered around tables decorated with white roses and baby's breath. Rebecca sat at the center of it all, radiant in a flowing pink dress, one hand resting on her rounded belly while the other gestured animatedly as she told some amusing anecdote. She looked so innocent, so genuinely happy, that for a moment I questioned what I was about to do. Perhaps the woman who had neglected Eleanor Hoffman to death was truly gone, replaced by someone capable of love and growth. Perhaps motherhood had changed her fundamental nature. Then I remembered Isabella's second birthday party, the one I learned about through social media 3 days after it happened. I remembered Christmas morning when I called to wish my granddaughter holiday greetings, only to be told that they were too busy opening presents to talk. I remembered the last time I had tried to visit, when Rebecca met me at the door with a smile that never reached her eyes and explained that it just wasn't a good time. I picked up the briefcase and walked toward the entrance, my heels clicking against the stone pathway like a countdown timer. The hostess at the reception desk barely glanced up as I passed, assuming I belonged among the other well-dressed women celebrating new life and fresh beginnings. The banquet room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Pink and silver balloons formed elaborate arches over tables laden with gifts wrapped in coordinating paper. Rebecca's friends, her mother, her sister, they all moved through the space with the easy confidence of people who belonged, who had never doubted their place in this carefully curated world. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking inventory. These women knew me as the difficult mother-in-law, the one who tried too hard and understood too little. They had heard Rebecca's version of our relationship, the carefully edited story that painted me as overbearing and old-fashioned, unable to accept that times had changed. Rebecca's laughter cut through the ambient noise like crystal breaking. She was describing Isabella's latest developmental milestone to a circle of admirers who hung on every word. Her face glowed with maternal pride and the confidence of someone who had successfully reinvented herself. Then she saw me. The laughter died in her throat. Her expression shifted from joy to confusion to something approaching fear as she realized I wasn't supposed to be here. Conversations around her faltered as women followed her gaze to where I stood, uninvited but undeniably present. "Rebecca," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "You look radiant. Motherhood becomes you." She struggled to her feet, one hand bracing against her chair for support. "Dorothy," she said, attempting to inject warmth into her voice. "What a surprise. I didn't expect to see you." "I'm sure you didn't," I replied, walking toward her with measured steps. But I couldn't miss the celebration of my future grandchild, especially since I funded it. The words hung in the air like incense at a funeral, sweet-smelling but ultimately toxic. Rebecca's mother materialized beside her daughter, a protective barrier dressed in lavender silk. "This is a private event," she said, her voice sharp with warning. "Family and close friends only." "Family," I repeated, tasting the irony. "Yes, let's talk about family. Let's talk about trust and loyalty and the bonds that tie us together." I set my purse down on a nearby table and opened the briefcase with deliberate precision. Rebecca's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She sank back into her chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. "What are you doing, Dorothy?" "I'm giving you a gift," I said, withdrawing a manila envelope from the briefcase. "Something I think you've been missing for quite some time." I held up the envelope so she could see her real name written in block letters across the front. "Rachel Chun Bradley," I read aloud. "Also known as Rebecca Chin Morrison. Also known as a woman who killed an elderly patient through systematic neglect while stealing medication to fund her drug-dealing operation." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place like actors waiting for their cue. Rebecca's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with the terror of someone whose deepest secrets had been dragged into the light. "That's not true," she whispered. "That's not who I am anymore." I opened the envelope and withdrew a photograph, holding it so only she could see. It showed a younger Rachel in scrubs, standing beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Eleanor Hoffman looked frail but alert, her eyes bright with intelligence and trust. "Eleanor trusted you," I said quietly. "She trusted you to care for her, to ease her pain, to treat her with dignity in her final months. Instead, you stole her medication and let her die in agony so you could make a profit." Rebecca's mother stepped closer, her face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. "What is she talking about, Rebecca? What is this about?" From the envelope, I withdrew a death certificate, yellowed with age but still legible. "Eleanor Hoffman," I read. "Cause of death: sepsis due to infected pressure sores. Contributory factors: medication non-compliance and inadequate hygiene care." I looked up at Rebecca, who was now crying silent tears that streaked her makeup. She was supposed to receive morphine every 6 hours for bone cancer pain. "But you were selling her morphine to dealers. So Eleanor spent her last weeks screaming in agony that could have been prevented." "No," Rebecca sobbed. "It wasn't like that. I was young. I made mistakes. That doesn't mean I killed anyone. The medical records say otherwise," I continued, withdrawing another document. "They show a pattern of falsified entries, claiming you administered medication that never left the supply cabinet. They show care plans that were ignored and symptoms that were dismissed." Isabella's face flashed in my mind, my granddaughter whom I barely knew, who would grow up shaped by the woman now sobbing in front of 40 witnesses. What kind of person steals pain medication from a dying woman? What kind of person prioritizes drug money over human suffering? Rebecca struggled to stand, her pregnancy making the movement awkward and desperate. "You don't understand," she said. "I was in debt from nursing school. I had bills I couldn't pay. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But someone did get hurt," I replied. "Eleanor Hoffman got hurt. She died in pain because you chose money over mercy. And now you want me to trust you with my granddaughter's well-being." The room erupted in whispers and gasps as the implications sank in. These women, Rebecca's friends and supporters, were realizing that the person they thought they knew was a carefully constructed lie. The glowing mother-to-be was actually a woman who had fled a scandal that would have landed her in prison. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" I turned to see my son standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, his face flushed from running. Someone must have called him, though I couldn't imagine Rebecca wanting him to witness this particular conversation. "I was just sharing some family history," I said calmly. "Your wife has such an interesting past. Did you know she used to work in elderly care? She was quite dedicated to her patients, especially when it came to managing their medication." Marcus looked between Rebecca's tear-streaked face and my composed expression, clearly trying to understand the dynamic he had walked into. "Rebecca, what is she talking about?" Rebecca reached for him with desperate hands. "She's lying, Marcus. She's making up stories because she's angry about not being invited. She's trying to ruin our family." I held up the police report, the one that detailed the investigation into Eleanor's death and the subsequent discovery of Rachel's drug operation. "Your wife fled Denver 3 years ago to escape prosecution for elder abuse and drug trafficking. She changed her name and created an entirely new identity to avoid the consequences of her actions." Marcus took the report with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the official letterhead and formal language that documented his wife's crimes. As he read, his expression changed from confusion to horror to something approaching recognition. "The frequent travel," I continued. "The reluctance to discuss her past. The minimal possessions and carefully crafted stories about her background. She wasn't being mysterious, Marcus. She was being careful not to leave a trail that could lead back to Rachel Bradley." The silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Rebecca sat in her chair like a broken doll, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her with each revelation. Her friends and family looked at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to betrayal. Eleanor Hoffman had a family, I said, withdrawing one final document from the envelope. A daughter who lives in Portland now. She's been looking for the woman responsible for her mother's death for 3 years. She'll be very interested to learn that Rachel Bradley is alive and well and living under a new name. Rebecca finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand what you've done," I said. To Eleanor, to her family, to my son and granddaughter. "I want you to face the consequences of your choices instead of running away to start over somewhere new." Marcus had finished reading the police report. His face was ashen, his hands shaking as he looked at the woman he had married, the mother of his child. "Rebecca, tell me this isn't true. Tell me there's some explanation for this." Rebecca opened her mouth but no words came. The evidence was overwhelming, documented by multiple agencies and corroborated by witnesses who had been waiting years for the chance to see justice served. "I'm not the same person I was then," she finally managed. "Changed. I would never hurt Isabella or the new baby. I'm a good mother." Eleanor's daughter thought her mother was in good hands too, I replied. "She trusted you to care for someone she loved, and you betrayed that trust for money. Why should anyone believe you wouldn't do it again?" The weight of her past had finally caught up with Rebecca Chin Morrison, and there was nowhere left to run. The room full of witnesses had seen her mask slip, revealing the woman underneath who was capable of unspeakable cruelty when it served her purposes. Marcus set the police report down and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds where other families were celebrating milestones without the shadow of hidden crimes. When he turned back to face us, his expression was resolved. "The party's over," he said quietly. "Everyone needs to leave." As the guests filed out in stunned silence, whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed, I packed my evidence back into the briefcase. The first phase of my plan was complete. Rebecca's carefully constructed identity had been destroyed in front of the people who mattered most to her. But this was just the beginning. Eleanor Hoffman deserved more than public humiliation. She deserved justice, and I intended to make sure she got it. Marcus stood beside Rebecca's chair, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that could have been comfort or control. They needed to talk, to decide how to handle the wreckage of their marriage and the future of their children. I walked toward the exit, leaving them to confront the truth about their relationship and the lies it had been built on. As I reached the door, Rebecca's voice stopped me. "Dorothy, wait, please." I turned to see her struggling to stand, her face streaked with tears but her eyes holding a desperate hope. "I know I've made mistakes, but I love Marcus and Isabella. I love this baby. I'm not the person I was in Denver." "People don't change that much, Rebecca," I said. "They just get better at hiding who they really are. Eleanor Hoffman trusted you with her life, and you chose money over mercy. That kind of moral corruption doesn't disappear because you move to a new city and change your name." I walked out into the afternoon sunshine, leaving behind the ruins of a family built on lies and the beginning of a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. Eleanor Hoffman could finally rest in peace, knowing that her story had been told and her suffering acknowledged. The drive home took me through the same rolling hills, but everything looked different now. The landscape that had seemed peaceful on the way to the country club now felt charged with possibility. Justice was finally within reach, and I had the power to ensure it was served. My phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Morrison in Denver. "Mrs. Patterson, I've reviewed the evidence you sent. We're reopening the Eleanor Hoffman case and issuing a warrant for Rachel Bradley's arrest. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." I pulled over to read the message twice, feeling a satisfaction that went deeper than personal revenge. This was about holding someone accountable for their actions, about ensuring that victims were not forgotten when their abusers tried to escape the consequences of their crimes. Eleanor Hoffman had died alone and in pain, betrayed by someone she trusted. But she would not be forgotten, and her death would finally have meaning if it prevented Rebecca from hurting anyone else. The second text came from Marcus. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can you come to the house?" I drove through neighborhoods I had known for decades, past houses where I had delivered catering orders and attended dinner parties back when my life was simpler. Those days felt like another lifetime now, when my biggest worry was whether my son was eating enough vegetables or getting sufficient sleep. Marcus was waiting on the front porch when I arrived, still in his work clothes but looking older than his 35 years. The weight of learning that his wife was a fugitive from justice had aged him in the space of a few hours. "Is it all true?" he asked without preamble. "Everything you said about Denver and Eleanor and the medication." "Every word," I replied. "I have copies of the police reports, medical records, and witness statements if you want to review them. Rebecca's real name is Rachel Chen Bradley, and she's been using a false identity since she fled Colorado to avoid prosecution." Marcus sat heavily on the porch steps, his head in his hands. Isabella's inside watching cartoons, completely oblivious to the fact that her world is about to fall apart. "How do I explain to a 4-year-old that her mother is wanted by the police?" "You tell her as little as possible and focus on keeping her safe," I said, sitting beside him on the steps where I had once helped him with homework and listened to his fears about starting middle school. "Children are resilient, Marcus, but they need stability and truth, even when the truth is difficult." "Rebecca wants us to disappear," he said. "She's talking about moving to Canada or Mexico, somewhere the extradition laws are complicated. She says we can start over as a family, that none of this matters because it happened so long ago." "And what do you think?" "I think the woman I married doesn't exist," he replied. "I think I've been living with a stranger who's capable of things I never imagined. I think about Eleanor Hoffman dying in pain while Rebecca counted drug money, and I wonder what other lies I've believed." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn where Isabella played with neighborhood children, her laughter carrying on the breeze like music. She was innocent in all of this, a child whose mother had built their family's foundation on the suffering of vulnerable people. "The police are reopening the case," I told Marcus. "There will be an arrest warrant and probably media attention. You need to decide whether you're going to help her run or help her face the consequences of her actions." Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching Isabella chase butterflies in the garden that Rebecca had planted the previous spring. Everything about their life together felt contaminated now, tainted by the knowledge of who she really was and what she had done. "What kind of mother steals medication from dying patients?" he asked finally. "What kind of person builds a family on that foundation and expects it to stand?" "The kind of person who sees other people as means to an end rather than human beings worthy of compassion," I replied. "Rebecca didn't just steal money, Marcus. She stole Eleanor's dignity, her comfort, her right to die without unnecessary suffering." Marcus stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the street where he had grown up and learned his values from a mother who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life. When he turned back to me, his expression was resolved. "I can't run with her," he said. "I can't teach my children that the solution to problems is to disappear and start over with new lies. Isabella deserves better than that." The front door opened and Rebecca appeared, now wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, her face puffy from crying but her expression determined. She had heard our conversation through the screen door, and her eyes held the desperate calculation of someone whose options were rapidly disappearing. "Marcus, we need to leave," she said. "Tonight. I've already packed bags for all of us. We can be across the border before morning." "No," Marcus said firmly. "We're not running, Rebecca. It's time to face what you did in Denver." Rebecca's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath the maternal mask. "You don't understand," she snarled. "If I go to prison, you'll be raising 2 children alone. Isabella will grow up without her mother. Is that what you want?" "What I want is for my children to grow up with parents they can respect," Marcus replied. "Parents who take responsibility for their actions instead of running away when things get difficult." Rebecca turned to me with hatred blazing in her eyes. "This is your fault," she said. "You couldn't accept that Marcus chose me over you, so you destroyed our family with your jealousy and spite." "I destroyed nothing," I replied calmly. "I simply revealed what was already there. You destroyed Eleanor Hoffman. You destroyed the trust of everyone who believed in you. I just made sure the truth finally came to light. The sound of a car door slamming drew our attention to the street, where Detective Morrison was getting out of an unmarked sedan accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Rebecca's face went white as she realized her time had run out. "Rachel Chun Bradley," Detective Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of years spent serving warrants on fugitives. "You're under arrest for elder abuse, theft, and trafficking controlled substances." Rebecca backed toward the door, her hands instinctively moving to protect her pregnant belly. "You can't arrest me," she said. "I'm 8 months pregnant. This could cause complications." "We'll make sure you receive appropriate medical care," Detective Morrison replied, nodding to the officers who moved to either side of the porch. "But you're coming with us either way." As the handcuffs clicked around Rebecca's wrists, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served, but it came at the cost of my son's happiness and my granddaughter's innocence. Isabella appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, her eyes wide with confusion as she watched her mother being led away by police officers. "Daddy, what's happening? Why are those men taking Mommy?" Marcus knelt down and gathered Isabella into his arms, his voice gentle despite the chaos surrounding them. "Mommy has to go away for a while, sweetheart. But you'll be safe with Daddy and Grandma Dorothy." Isabella looked at me with the solemn expression children wear when they sense that the adult world has shifted in ways they don't understand. "Will Mommy come back?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "But we'll take care of you no matter what happens." As Detective Morrison's car pulled away with Rebecca in the back seat, I realized that my quest for justice had achieved more than I had dared hope. Eleanor Hoffman would finally have her day in court, even if it came 3 years late. Rebecca would face the consequences of her actions instead of disappearing into another carefully constructed identity. But the victory felt hollow as I watched my son comfort his confused daughter and contemplated the long road ahead. Isabella would grow up knowing that her mother was in prison for crimes that most people couldn't imagine. The baby Rebecca carried would be born into a world where his father was a single parent and his mother was a convicted felon. Had my pursuit of justice been worth the collateral damage? Had Eleanor Hoffman's memory been properly honored? Or had I simply used her suffering as justification for my own revenge? These questions would haunt me in the months to come as Marcus struggled with single parenthood, and Isabella asked increasingly difficult questions about her mother's absence. But as I tucked my granddaughter into bed that night in the house where her father had once slept safely, I knew I had made the right choice. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. Some crimes demand accountability regardless of the passage of time. Eleanor Hoffman had died without justice, forgotten by everyone except the family who mourned her and the woman who had killed her through calculated neglect. Now at least her story had been told. Her suffering had been acknowledged. And the person responsible for her death would finally face the consequences that had been delayed but not denied. Justice, even when it comes late, is still justice. And sometimes that has to be enough. The trial began 6 months later on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day I had first confronted Rebecca at her baby shower. She sat at the defendant's table in a prison-issued maternity dress, her belly round with the child she had given birth to while in custody. Marcus had named his son David after my father, and was raising both children with a fierce protectiveness that reminded me of myself during his own childhood. He testified about Rebecca's deception with quiet dignity, describing how she had systematically isolated him from his family while building their relationship on a foundation of lies. But it was Eleanor Hoffman's daughter, Patricia, whose testimony brought the courtroom to tears. She described her mother's final weeks, the unexplained deterioration, the desperate phone calls about inadequate care that no one seemed able to address. "My mother trusted everyone," Patricia said from the witness stand. She believed that people were fundamentally good, that the nurses and aides who cared for her wanted to help. She never could have imagined that someone would steal her medication and let her suffer for profit. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Rebecca's crimes. Medical records showed a clear pattern of medication theft. Financial records revealed deposits to her bank account that coincided with drug sales. Testimony from other nursing home employees painted a picture of systematic abuse that extended far beyond Eleanor's case. Rebecca's defense attorney argued that she had been young and desperate, overwhelmed by debt and making poor choices under financial pressure. He portrayed her as a reformed person who had learned from her mistakes and built a stable family life. But the prosecutor's closing argument focused on the human cost of Rebecca's choices. Eleanor Hoffman died in agony because this defendant chose money over mercy, he said. She betrayed the trust placed in her by vulnerable people who had no other advocates, no other protection against her greed. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Rebecca was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after 5 years contingent on her completion of rehabilitation programs and restitution to Eleanor's family. As the judge read the sentence, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Eleanor Hoffman's death finally had meaning. Her suffering had been acknowledged by a court of law, and the person responsible had been held accountable. Marcus and I left the courthouse together, with Isabella holding my hand and baby David sleeping in his father's arms. The media attention had been intense but brief, a cautionary tale about the importance of background checks and the danger of trusting people who seem too good to be true. Isabella, now 5 years old, had adapted to her new reality with the resilience of childhood. She knew that her mother had made bad choices and was in timeout, as she called it, for a very long time. She asked fewer questions about Rebecca as the months passed, focusing instead on the stability that Marcus and I provided. We had become an unconventional family, bound together by shared loss and the commitment to protect the innocent. I moved in with Marcus to help with childcare, finally getting the relationship with my grandchildren that Rebecca had denied me for so many years. Isabella thrived under consistent care and honest communication. David, who would never know his mother outside of supervised prison visits, grew surrounded by love and the knowledge that his father and grandmother would always protect him. Sometimes late at night, when the children were asleep and Marcus was reviewing legal documents related to Rebecca's ongoing appeals, I would think about Eleanor Hoffman and wonder if she would approve of what I had done in her memory. I had destroyed a family to seek justice for a woman I had never met. I had separated children from their mother to ensure that her crimes were punished. I had chosen the pursuit of truth over the preservation of peace. But Eleanor had been someone's daughter too, someone's granddaughter, a person whose suffering mattered as much as my own family's happiness. She had died alone and forgotten, her pain dismissed as the inevitable consequence of age and illness. Now her story was part of the official record. Now her death had meaning. Now other vulnerable people might be protected because Rachel Bradley's crimes had finally been exposed and punished. The cost had been high, but some things are worth any price. Justice for the forgotten. Protection for the vulnerable. Truth in place of comfortable lies. As I watched my son raise his children with the values I had tried to instill in him, I knew that Eleanor Hoffman's legacy would live on in the way we treated each other and the way we stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Her memory had become part of our family's story, a reminder that our choices have consequences that extend far beyond our own lives. She had been failed by the system meant to protect her, but her suffering had not been meaningless. Sometimes the dead speak through the living. Sometimes justice comes late but still arrives. Sometimes a grandmother's love becomes the sword that cuts through deception to reach the truth beneath. Eleanor Hoffman had been forgotten by everyone except the family who loved her and the woman who killed her. But her memory lived on in the way I held my grandchildren, the way I taught them to treat others with kindness and respect, the way I made sure they understood that their actions had consequences that rippled far beyond their own lives. Rebecca would be eligible for parole in 5 years, assuming she completed the required programs and demonstrated genuine remorse for her crimes. Whether she would be allowed back into Isabella and David's lives would depend on many factors, including the children's own wishes and the recommendations of court-appointed psychologists. I hoped, for their sake, that she would use her time in prison to become the person she had pretended to be. That she would learn to feel genuine empathy for the people she had hurt. That she would understand the magnitude of what she had stolen from Eleanor Hoffman and her family. But hope and trust were different things, and trust had to be earned through consistent actions over time. Rebecca had proven herself capable of extraordinary deception when it served her purposes. She had shown that she could prioritize her own needs over the suffering of vulnerable people. Those patterns didn't change overnight, and they certainly didn't change because someone got caught and faced consequences. Real change required acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine remorse for the harm caused, and a commitment to different choices going forward. Time would tell whether Rebecca possessed the moral courage necessary for that kind of transformation. Until then, my job was to protect the children she had left behind and ensure they grew up with the values their mother had abandoned. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of raising children who felt safe and loved. Isabella learned to ride a bicycle in the same driveway where her father had mastered that skill decades earlier. David took his first steps in the living room where Marcus had once played with blocks and toy trucks. I read them the same bedtime stories I had read to Marcus, watched them discover the same books that had shaped their father's imagination, helped them navigate the same childhood challenges that every generation faces. But underneath the normalcy was the knowledge that their family had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and redemption. Isabella occasionally asked about her mother, usually triggered by seeing other families where both parents were present. I answered her questions honestly but age-appropriately, focusing on the importance of making good choices and treating others with kindness. When she was 8 years old, Isabella asked me directly if her mother was a bad person. I considered the question carefully before answering. "Your mother made very bad choices that hurt people," I told her. "But people are complicated, and no one is entirely good or entirely bad. What matters is that you learn from her mistakes and choose to be kind and honest in your own life." The simplicity of childhood allowed Isabella to accept this explanation and move on to more immediate concerns, like whether she could have a sleepover with her best friend or if we could get a puppy for Christmas. But I knew that as she grew older, she would grapple with more complex questions about identity, nature versus nurture, and whether the capacity for cruelty was something she might have inherited. Those conversations would come in time, and Marcus and I would face them together with the same commitment to truth and love that had guided us through the immediate crisis. We would help her understand that she was not defined by her mother's choices, that she had the power to write her own story with whatever values she chose to embrace. David, who would never remember living with Rebecca, faced different challenges. His identity would be shaped by absence rather than betrayal, by questions about a mother he had never really known rather than disillusionment with someone he had loved. We kept photographs of Rebecca from before her arrest, images that showed her holding David as a newborn, smiling with what appeared to be genuine maternal love. Whether that love had been real or performative was impossible to determine, but David deserved to believe that he had been wanted and cherished, at least in those early weeks. The extended family slowly healed from the scandal that had torn through our lives like a tornado. Marcus's sister, who had initially defended Rebecca, came to understand the magnitude of the deception and began including us in family gatherings again. Old friends who had distanced themselves during the trial reached out to offer support and acknowledge their own misjudgments. But some relationships never recovered. People who had been closer to Rebecca than to our family chose to believe that I had orchestrated an elaborate frame job out of jealousy and spite. They preferred the comfort of thinking that grandmothers were petty and vindictive, rather than accepting that they had been fooled by a woman capable of terrible cruelty. I learned to live with their judgment, understanding that some people would always choose the easier explanation over the more disturbing truth. What mattered was that Eleanor Hoffman had received justice, that vulnerable people were marginally safer because Rebecca's crimes had been exposed, and that my grandchildren were growing up in an environment based on honesty rather than elaborate lies. The private investigator I had hired sent me updates on Rebecca's appeals and behavior in prison. She had been placed in a minimum security facility due to her pregnancy and lack of violent crime history. She worked in the library, participated in parenting classes, and maintained a clean disciplinary record. Whether this represented genuine reform or calculated compliance designed to improve her chances at early parole was impossible to determine from the outside. People in prison learned quickly that good behavior was rewarded and that expressions of remorse, whether sincere or not, influenced parole board decisions. I hoped she was using her time productively, that she was genuinely grappling with the harm she had caused and developing the empathy that had been so notably absent during her caregiving career. But hope was not the same as expectation, and I remained vigilant about protecting the children from further disappointment. As Isabella approached her 10th birthday, she began asking more sophisticated questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. A school assignment about family history had sparked her curiosity about the events that had shaped her early childhood. "Do you think people can really change, Grandma Dorothy?" she asked one evening while we worked together on a jigsaw puzzle featuring a lighthouse surrounded by storm clouds. "I think people can choose to behave differently," I replied carefully. "Whether that represents real change or just better self-control depends on their motivation and their willingness to acknowledge the harm they've caused." "Do you think my mom has really changed?" The question I had been dreading for years had finally arrived, posed with the directness that only children possess. Isabella deserved an honest answer, but she also deserved hope for the future and the possibility of reconciliation with her mother. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said finally. "That's something we'll find out together when she's released from prison. But what I do know is that you and David are surrounded by people who love you unconditionally, and that will never change regardless of what happens with your mother." Isabella nodded with the solemnity of a child who had learned early that the adult world was complicated and sometimes disappointing. She had inherited her father's thoughtful nature and his ability to process difficult emotions without becoming overwhelmed by them. The lighthouse in our puzzle stood firm against the painted storm, its beam cutting through darkness to guide lost ships safely home. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor for our family's journey through the chaos Rebecca had created and the stability we had built in its aftermath. Some storms were too powerful to prevent, but survival was possible with the right preparation and the commitment to weather whatever came. Eleanor Hoffman had been caught in a storm of institutional neglect and individual cruelty that had ultimately cost her life. But her memory had become a lighthouse for us, guiding our choices and reminding us that every vulnerable person deserved protection and dignity. The story I had uncovered about Rebecca's past had been devastating in its implications, but it had also been illuminating in its revelation of human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Eleanor had suffered, but she had not been forgotten. Rebecca had escaped consequences for years, but justice had eventually found her. Our family had been fractured, but we had rebuilt ourselves on a foundation of truth rather than lies. As I watched Isabella carefully place the final piece of the lighthouse puzzle, completing the image of steadfast strength in the face of adversity, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. We had honored Eleanor's memory, protected innocent children, and demonstrated that some principles were worth defending regardless of the cost. The dead could indeed speak through the living, their voices carried forward by those who refused to let their suffering be meaningless. Eleanor Hoffman's story had become part of our story, a reminder that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for ourselves but for those who could no longer fight for themselves. The price of truth had been high, but the alternative, allowing Rebecca to continue her deception while Eleanor's death remained unavenged, would have been unthinkable. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep, some lies too damaging to ignore, some injustices too profound to overlook. In the end, we had chosen the harder path, the one that led through pain toward genuine healing rather than the easier route that preserved comfortable illusions. It had been worth every difficult moment, every sleepless night, every complicated conversation with confused children. Eleanor Hoffman could finally rest in peace, her suffering acknowledged and her death given meaning through the justice that had finally, inexorably, found its way home.